In part 2 of this measuring and marking series, let's get down to measuring and marking. When you're measuring your cuts, you have to bear in mind that both your marking instruments and your cutting instruments have thickness to them, especially when you're using woodworking power tools such as bandsaws or circular saws. You have to realize that the blade itself has a curve or width of the blade. In this instance, this blade is about 2 mils wide. What this means is 2 mils of material will be removed along the cut line. This means two things. One, you can't do what I see students do in the workshop, where they try to measure out all their cut lines. Then they bring it to the bandsaw, where they do their cuts. Now, if you do that, you will end up with this material being okay, but the next material will now be 2 mils too short. Secondly, you need to know where your blade is supposed to sit in relation to your marking line. Do not try to line up the center of the blade with the center of the line, as this will result in, for this blade, a 1 mil error for both sides of the line. The correct technique is to determine the scrap side, so let's say this side, put a mark on it so you don't forget. Place your blade entirely on the scrap side, and this will ensure you get the dimension you need on the material that you keep. It's good practice to put a mark because most of the time you're not marking a material where you're actually cutting it. Especially if both sides of the material are roughly equal, you'll forget which side you actually want by the time you get the piece to the cutting machine. Now to marking. Conventional wisdom would say make sure you use a very sharp pencil, in this case a sharpened clutch pencil or a mechanical pencil. However, sometimes I also find it helpful to use a thick pencil or Sharpie and use the edge of the mark to determine my cut rather than the line itself. I also need to think which side of the measurement I want to put my mark on. So imagine if this ruler is my blade. Am I cutting to this edge, or am I cutting to this edge, or am I cutting to this edge like that? You might want to standardize your technique to avoid confusion. You can also see why sometimes if I use a very sharp pencil, it might lead to trouble as I can't see for sure where I'm actually cutting. One tip: if you are sanding a piece of material onto this sander, put your mark on the piece you actually want to keep. This is because it's easier to see where you have sanded to your mark rather than trying to determine if your mark has been completely sanded off. Now, with all that said, for all intents and purposes, when marking and cutting with a scalpel blade, you can safely assume that it has zero curve. Now, it does actually have thickness, but if you can cut and mark that precisely, I tip my hat off to you. Now, don't shy away from marking with a scalpel blade. Firstly, it's more precise, and woodworkers tend to use marking blades when they're marking the materials anyway to prevent tear out when they're cross-cutting. But that's a different conversation. Finally, don't try to measure components more precise than your measuring tools will allow. For a standard ruler such as this one, in metric, you can reasonably measure down to 1/2 a millimeter. As you can see here, there is markings for every mil and 1/2 mil. Now, if you don't have those 1/2 mil markings, you can still reasonably assume that if a measurement falls between two markings, it's 0.5. So here, right here, will be 63.5. Don't try to mark a 63.8 closer to the right or a 63.2 closer to the left. That would just result in problems later when pieces don't match up. If such measurements exist in your model due to the way a 1.1 real-world model scales down, try to consolidate all your dimensions during your planning stage. In this case, I might fudge both dimensions to 63.5 mils as I can accurately measure down to that dimension instead. Remember in part 1 what I said about making sure the proportions of the model looks right as a sum of its parts rather than the individual parts themselves. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment if you have any questions and I'll see you in the next video.